Dear citizens of the world, I'm Padmini Arhant, author and presenter, padminiarhant.com, prakriti.padminiarhant.com, representing divinity. I welcome you all to the topic, Russia-NATO Peace Deal. The content in the message is presented as constructive data. The substance draws global attention to real events, policies, and decisions describing the state of affairs between Russia and NATO and the rest of the world. Russia-NATO Permanent Peace Deal. The two powerful sides, namely Russia and United States, led NATO continue to dispute on security in Eastern Europe, though both sides have their share of arguments and justifications in this matter. The present situation calls for a permanent security arrangement in recognition of all nations' sovereignty and territorial integrity in Eastern Europe. Notwithstanding, the global peace and security is endangered considering the alarming nuclear status of both Russia and United States together with NATO allies posing a major threat in the present time. To begin with, it is important for all sides to focus on current problems, recent events, that is, since the turn of the 21st century, with geopolitical and geoeconomic landscape shifting dramatically in the region and worldwide. NATO, led by United States, has to leave the Cold War era with former USSR, that is Union of Soviet Socialist Republic as it was known at that time, behind, and engage with Russia as a sovereign nation equivalent in nuclear power, if not more, besides being a permanent member in the UN Security Council with veto entitlement. As a sovereign nation, Russia has genuine security concerns regarding NATO presence and alliance near Russian territory. According to United States and NATO, the alliance is claimed as defense strategy against Russia from any potential threats in Eastern and Central Europe. The Western position against Russia in this regard might very well be based on 20th century school of thoughts and think tanks, as well as Cold War renegades perspective. However, in the 21st century, upon evaluating military interventions, illegal invasion and occupation of foreign land globally, United States and NATO combined forces by far rank the frontrunner and foremost aggressor, followed by China. Again, the 21st century first quarter in the last 2 decades, United States and NATO footprints on foreign soil via military bases, naval and air dominance is widely known and prevalent until now. The World War II in 1942 brought Germany and Japan's imperial quest to an end. United Nations Security Council was formed without them, that is, without Germany and Japan. The two nations, Germany and Japan, diverted course from political and military status to build economic strength and have successfully become economically stable nations since then. In comparison with Germany and Japan, Russia became the United Nations Security Council permanent member with veto power and sought imperial status as USSR in the latter half of 20th century. This route proved extremely arduous and economically challenging for USSR and consequentially led to the collapse of Soviet Union. Russia, in the course of UNSC formation and membership also became the nuclear power like the rest of the United Nations Security Council permanent members, namely United States, Britain, France, and China. Among the UNSC 5 permanent members, following former Soviet Union dissolution, Russia lags behind the other 4 members, namely United States, Britain, France, and China, in threatening foreign sovereignty and border incursions in different parts of the world. Interestingly, the 5 permanent members have imperialistic past and present track record with West, as NATO, along with United States and China, are existential threat to sovereignty and territorial integrity at the moment. Not to mention the United States, Western Europe, and China partnership in the worst health and economic disaster unleashed through global pandemic until now is a verifiable experience. The Russian Federation, since disintegration of Soviet Union, is struggling economically due to multifaceted reasons, and one of them being Western sanctions, urging Russia to conform to Western-style democracy, which in itself is highly questionable and accordingly merit exclusive focus on this topic, which will be presented in the immediate future. The world witnessed United States and NATO endeavors on democracy in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Thailand, and Ukraine, to name a few, in the last 2 decades of modern age. The end results were as follows. Iraq was not democratized, instead demolished by United States and NATO via invasion and occupation. Afghanistan is Talibanized after 2 decades of United States and NATO shelling and occupation of the country, leaving Afghan women, children, and youth at the mercy of Taliban government. The disorganized withdrawal in 2021 by United States and NATO in compliance with Taliban demands produced mayhem, with locals latching on to airplane wings in worldview to flee Taliban rule. The foreigners, mostly United States defense personnel and family, were stranded for months end, and many are still desperately trying to exit since Taliban takeover of the Islamic State. Libya was not liberated and in turn transformed into a lawless land with free self-serve on Libyan oil by foreign entities is the norm in the aftermath of NATO bombing the North African country. Syria was decimated under the pretext of democratization, leaving millions of Syrians displaced in their homeland with political asylum denied to Syrian refugees in the aggressor's land. Thailand, the democratically elected government headed by then Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra in 2011 was forcefully and undemocratically removed from office by turning off electric power supply to the Prime Minister's office. The serving Prime Minister's office was denied and deprived of electric power supply during working hours at that time. The direct Western intrusion in Thailand replaced then democratically elected government of Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra, accused of corruption. And then that government was replaced with incorrigibly corrupt military junta. Western directed military junta replaced the democratically elected government in Thailand in 2014. Ukraine was introduced to startling real insurrection in the most violent format, with democratically elected government of President Viktor Yanukovych forced out of office literally at gunpoint in Worldview in 2014. Needless to say, the slew of United States-led Western decapitation of democracy was underway in different parts of the world in 2014. Amid these events, Ukraine in particular held hostage since 2014 by the West, United States and EU direct meddling and installation of neo-Nazi governments post-Western coup in that country. The irony is the rhetoric echoed following the script warning Russia against invasion of Ukraine, when in fact it is not if Russia invades Ukraine. The reality is Ukraine already invaded and occupied since 2014 by Western political and economic stakeholders, reaping personal financial gains at ordinary Ukrainians' expense. The latest revelation is expecting Ukraine to become a NATO ally in the controversial NATO's open door policy, inviting members in Europe, the Eastern Europe, as the focal point, leading to status quo. Clearly, United States and NATO's role in the 21st century could hardly be justified as defensive anywhere in the world in the absence of overt or covert security threats to United States and Western states from nations targeted by the US and NATO so far. The economic sanctions used and exploited by the West against nations designated as indefinite adversaries constitute economic war. It is also the most inhumane and hostile action predominantly affecting innocent population of the country as well as the rest of the world, with businesses deprived of inter-economic opportunity from these nations. Juxtaposed, no Western nations or allies, regardless of chaos and catastrophe inflicted by them worldwide, have ever been subject to economic sanctions or trade embargo that are otherwise common practice against non-Western nations in the past and present. The Western trend continued till date, raised questions on ethical and democratic essence, ignored time and time again by the so-called Western democracy. Another bone of contention for United States against Russia is strategic arms, including long and short-range ballistic missiles that are now in place with the New START treaty, that was Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START treaty, extended in 2021. The original START treaty between United States and Russia, the original START treaty was signed in April 2010, was ratified in February 2011. The treaty, set to expire in February 2021, was extended to another 5 years until February 2026 by the current administration of President Joe Biden in the United States, with Russian Federation consent and cooperation. So there should be really no issues in this regard, barring non-compliance from either side. Although the imminent requirement is global denuclearization and nuclear disarmament, as elaborated by me in the domain padmini.arhant.com since 2008 and until now. There is no doubt nuclear threat continues to endanger life and humanity at large, even though contemporarily mankind forced to deal with global pandemic let loose by withholding critical scientific information. the biowarfare via pathogens of tremendous potency in mutation and virulence consumed several millions of lives, and crippled health and economic survival world over. United States and NATO, citing Russia's Cold War tendency, engaged in not only building NATO alliance in Eastern Europe, but also utilized the Eastern Bloc as de facto nuclear partners against Russia. This setting is very similar to United States arrangement in Korean Peninsula and Asia Pacific, arguably against other nations, namely North Korea and China, sharing borders with Russia. All around, Russia is faced with United States and NATO incursions in the Baltic Sea, Black Sea, Caspian Sea, South China Sea, and Yellow Sea. The Russian neighbors Iran on Caspian Sea, China and North Korea on South China and Yellow Sea respectively. These are maritime borders where United States routinely conducts naval and military exercise. Additionally, United States is militarily engaged against Iran, North Korea, and China in this part of the world. Russia, as a neighbor, has to contend with this dilemma as well. United States and NATO issues against Russia is Cold War calculations reminiscent of Soviet era. Henceforth, the West seek non-adversarial relations from Russia towards neighbors in Eastern Bloc. Russia has rejected such Western claims and project NATO occupation near Russian territory as the burgeoning issue. Russian Federation clarifications on former Soviet Union, on former Soviet nations and territories in Eastern and Central Europe as well as Central Asia as independent sovereign states with demarcated boundaries is to be stated and incorporated in the Russia-NATO Accord. Russian military activities, whether on Black or Baltic Sea, and land drills should be on Russian land and waters to dispel any concern on possible Russian infringement on territorial rights of states near and far from Russia. These states in this context are Ukraine and Georgia, with whom Russia is yet to reconcile normal relations in all fronts, that is mutually beneficial political, economic, and cultural ties to maintain peace and security. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, as EU members and NATO allies, are weaponized, including nuclear stockpiles with training on the use of nuclear arsenal or component, is Russia's one of many major complaints that are detailed below. Having examined United States and NATO apprehensions against Russia, there is no ambivalence. They are associated with former Soviet Union. Any repeat developments from Russia in the present time is not apparent on the international and territorial infiltration. However, the latest developments in eastern Ukraine has caused concerns among members, not only in the Western nations, but in other regions as well, which will be discussed in Russia-Ukraine Treaty. Crimea is a state referendum and constitutional amendment-driven union with Russian Federation of Crimean citizens' choice. Furthermore, as stated earlier on this topic, the Crimea and Ukraine status quo is entirely and exclusively brought upon by United States and EU insurrection on Ukraine's then democratically elected government. The Western acknowledgement in this respect is long overdue and would further assist in alleviating misconception on Russian territorial annexation on Crimea. Russia's stance on various issues regarding United States and NATO were detailed in the public press release from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia on February 17 this year, that is just the past week, February 17, 2022. Moscow's statement per public release are as follows. Number 1, Russia has no plans to invade Ukraine. Moscow calls the conflict in Ukraine, quote, entirely internal in character, end quote. Russia claims that Crimea's case is closed. As explained earlier, Crimea was a voluntary union with Russian Federation enabled by Western-generated political unrest and Ukraine accommodating such crisis on their turf in 2014. US must withdraw from Russian borders. That is another call from Moscow. Russia has no forces on the territory of Ukraine, the MFA said in the document, adding that the deployments of troops within Russia's own territory do not and cannot concern the fundamental interests of the United States, end quote. By contrast, Russia said the United States and its NATO allies have expanded their military infrastructure eastward, violating both the 1990 Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe, that was the CFE, and the 1997 Founding Act on Mutual Relations, Cooperation and Security between Russia and NATO. Moscow insists on the withdrawal of all US armed forces and weapons deployed in Central and Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe, and the Baltics. Number 4, Russia maintains NATO's open door policy violates Russian security. While the US remains committed to NATO's policy of open doors, not ruling out admission of any country that applies to the alliance, Moscow noted that this violates the commitments NATO made in June 1991 to not endanger legitimate interests of other states or create new lines of division in Europe. It also clashes with the principle of indivisibility, says Moscow, of security, which the US committed to under the treaties that established the Organization for European Security Cooperation, OSCE, namely not to enhance their security at the expense of the security of others. In Russia's view, we call on the US and NATO to return to their international obligations in the sphere of supporting peace and security, the MFA said. We expect from the alliance specific proposals on the form and content of legal guarantees that NATO will not expand further to the east. Number 5, Moscow wants indivisible security for all and not just NATO. Washington needs to demonstrate it actually believes in the principle of indivisible security, Moscow argued, accusing the US of refusing to give up its counterproductive and destabilizing course of seeking advantages for itself and its allies at the expense of Russian security interests while threatening Russia's borders, says Moscow. In Moscow's view, the right of countries to freely choose or change their security arrangements, including entering alliances which the US cites, is not absolute, but is only half the formula contained in existing European security treaties. The document points out that Washington keeps omitting the second half about not enhancing one's own security at the expense of others. Number 6, no nukes in Europe from NATO. There was no answer to the Russian proposal to stop deploying nuclear weapons outside one's own territory, something the US has repeatedly done with NATO allies, in violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, the MFA said. Such weapons are currently deployed in the territory of several NATO members and are capable of targeting Russia. Moscow insists they must be withdrawn, the infrastructure for quickly redeploying them to Europe dismantled, and NATO must stop training non-nuclear members in the handling of such weapons. Without the removal of this irritant, discussion on the topic of non-strategic nuclear weapons is impossible, Russia said. Number 7, violation of red lines may lead to military technical response. The US and NATO are increasing their military activity on Russia's borders while ignoring Moscow's red lines and fundamental security interests, the MFA said, describing the situation as a cause for alarm. Russia described ultimatums and threats of sanctions as unacceptable and said they undermine the chances of reaching actual diplomatic agreements. Since the US is not prepared to discuss firm and legally binding guarantees of Russian security, Moscow will be forced to respond, including through the implementation of measures of a military technical nature, the MFA said. Now that is the document that was published by the Russian Foreign Ministry for public knowledge and obviously to convey the information to the relevant sides, namely United States and NATO. United States and NATO occupation in Eastern Europe is clearly the foundation of the lingering military standoff between two nuclear powers, the United States and Russia. So United States taxpayers are footing the bulk of NATO operation. The issue was brought to Europe's attention by former President Donald Trump, much to domestic political opponents and their European counterparts' ire and criticism. The United States military bases around the world are close to nearly 1,000, adding to phenomenal defense expenditure with American citizens burdened in sovereign debt. In reality, the conventional warfare has shifted from ground to air, cyber, and relevantly biological weapons like the global pandemic paralyzing health and economy in massive magnitude. Furthermore, the purpose of nuclear status is increasingly proven an economic liability in maintenance and modernization. The nuclear prowess is claimed by nuclear states as defense mechanism in deterrence and not defiance. The nuclear stockpiles among nuclear and non-nuclear nations, possessions as de facto partners like with NATO, exacerbate vulnerability in any region. Overall, nuclear world endanger life, environment, global peace and security. No climate treaty is meaningful and effective alongside nuclear race and nuclear threats, bringing nations to the brink of nuclear confrontation. The scenario has risen in the Cuban Missile Crisis, demanding reason and rationale to prevail at that time. The world has no option but to commit and begin nuclear disarmament without exception in clear transparency. The nuclear war would only make the world go blind. Such possibilities must be eliminated at all costs, for there will be no winners and critically no survivors either. To express regrets or rejoice the annihilation despite the latter bizarre response. Russia's security expectations as a sovereign nation is fair and reasonable. At the same time, Russia's assurance exemplified in action, providing synonymous sense of security, recognition of sovereignty and territorial integrity of nations near and far, namely Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and any former Soviet republics, or for that matter, the Russian naval base Tartus in Syria, is imperative. Any form of occupation gaining sovereign jurisdiction, such as in Tartus, Syria, creates speculations on real intention with or without the occupied territories' approval for their interim safety and national as well as regional security. In other words, the occupation of foreign territory by any nation at any given time or prolonged period is violation of sovereignty and territorial integrity. Russia in the domestic front, moving towards republic, elected and represented democracy, is pertinent in realization of Russian citizens' political rights to elect government and head of the state in a free and fair election. The election would be democratic only upon free access to political contenders of people's choice to contest in local and national election without being denied participation and subject to any form of hostility and extremities such as imprisonment in the absence of fair trial. These are significant milestones for Russia, a nation that has come a long way, with Russian citizens yet to experience true democracy. Western democracy, on the other hand, prefers and supports those so-called democracies obliging Western foreign and economic policy that are designed to favor them and none other. The democratic systems exercising independence in terms of trading partners and economic viability are removed from governance or punished with economic sanctions. The convenient tool to isolate nations not in agreement with Western policy. The case in point is Ukraine in 2014. Then incumbent President Viktor Yanukovych choosing neighbor Russia for economic deals was not tolerated by European Union, prompting the violent coup d'etat, with United States leading the insurrection against Ukrainian government in 2014. The Western democracy intolerance came to light in the wake of former German Navy Vice Admiral K. Schonbach comments on Russian President Vladimir Putin, deserving respect and Crimea not winnable for Ukraine. The German Navy chief had to resign for personal opinion on international matter. Western democracy is debatable on all these grounds for not standing by the real democratic values and people's choice leadership and governments anywhere. On the contrary, the Western initiated and instigated overthrow of democratic governments are prominent thus far. The Western democracy paradoxical paradigm undermine democracy in nations, enabling fundamentalism and other types of authoritarianism. The unequivocal fact is governments are run by oligarchs, regardless of the political system being democratic or not in the world. The European World Economic Forum, secret society originating from Bavaria, Germany, or Bilderberg in Netherlands, World Health Organization debacle on the global pandemic, Swiss banks sheltering illegal money from anywhere, fostering and fomenting corruption, the root cause behind developing nations' hindrance in pervasive economic growth and development. These are few among several examples confirming conspicuous flaws in Western democracy. United States and NATO honoring Russia's legitimate security interests with evacuation of NATO presence in Eastern Europe and abandoning political and military interference in Ukraine and other states in that region would facilitate democracy and stability. Europe, in the second quarter of 21st century, is at the crossroads to migrate from military aggression via NATO against Russia to forge economic relations with Russia, crucially in the energy sector, given the geographic location and proximity. After all, when the war is over at some point in time, hopefully that would never happen in terms of the war in Ukraine or in that region or anywhere for that matter, where nuclear powers face each other and lead to nuclear confrontation. Hopefully that would never ever happen, and all efforts would be made to avert and mitigate such potential disaster. So the war were to happen at any point in time, the economic priorities would have to be met somehow for existence. The choice between military incursions via NATO against Russia and economic benefits in energy and other trades from Russia could not be hard for Europe, facing aging population and volatile economic prospects in the energy-dependent manufacturing sector. The Western concept of globalized economy is contradictory to isolation, alienation, and segregation policy that are proved counterproductive more than ever. The relation between United States and Russia must improve in good faith and mutual trust as two equal, sensible, and militarily sensitive partners pledged to denuclearization, paving way for global peace, unity, and harmony, protecting humanity and environment, not harming any life on earth. United States and NATO pursuing democratic and diplomatic means with Russia is prudent and promising in establishing permanent peace deal. Above all, it is incumbent upon every nation to save the planet from peril, averting danger from nuclear force, the bioweapons, and any other treacherous strategy against anyone, anywhere in the world. May peace and tranquility triumph for humanity, progress, and prosperity. God bless humanity and the world at large. I am Padmini Arhant, author and presenter, padminiarhant.com, prakriti.padminiarhant.com, representing divinity. I appreciate your attention and interest. Thank you for your patience. Thank you.